Imagine, for a moment, that everything you were ever taught about the geography of this world is a carefully constructed lie, a veil drawn over a history so vast, so glorious, and so utterly terrifying that modern science refuses to even breathe its name. Can you believe that beneath the churning, endless blue of the Indian Ocean there lies a gravesite, a titanic tomb that swallowed an entire civilization more spiritually advanced than anything humanity has dared to dream of since? This is not folklore whispered by sailors on dark nights, nor is it some quaint myth from a forgotten culture. This is the shattered memory of Lemuria, the motherland of humanity, the lost continent that dared to touch the face of the cosmos and was brutally, instantaneously wiped from the map in a catastrophe no one saw coming. Or perhaps a catastrophe that only the highest priests saw and desperately tried to prevent. We are talking about a landmass so colossal it dwarfed Australia, a geographical anomaly that anchored the ancient world. Yet today, not a single physical shard remains above the waves to tell its terrifying tale of extinction. The story begins not with fire and brimstone, but with unparalleled peace, a golden age so perfect it defies rational description. Picture a world where technology wasn't forged from steel and gears, but from crystalline energy, flowing directly from the planet's magnetic core, harnessed by beings whose primary focus was not conquest or commerce, but the evolution of consciousness itself. The Lemurians, often called Muvians, were the original star children, luminous beings who walked the planet when the rest of the globe was still wrestling with fire, possessing knowledge that makes our modern quantum physics look like child's play. Their cities were not built structures, but grown sculptures, living architecture crafted from enormous, rainbow-hued quartz, reflecting the eternal light of the sun and moon and patterns designed to harmonize the human spirit. They lived in perfect attunement with the Earth's energy grid, utilizing the ley lines as superhighways for instantaneous travel and communication, traversing vast distances not with crude vehicles, but with pure thought and highly focused vibrational energy. Their existence was a symphony of spiritual power, a silent testament to what humanity could achieve if it unlocked its true dormant potential. But like any paradise, the seeds of destruction were eventually sown, not by external invaders, but by the relentless grinding friction of internal hubris, a creeping shadow of moral decay that even the most enlightened spiritual leaders could not fully halt. We must understand that Lemuria was a society ruled by the Elders, a council of incredibly long-lived, almost angelic beings known as the Rainbow People, who had achieved such mastery over their physical forms that they seemed immortal. They oversaw a system where every single inhabitant understood their purpose, their dharma in the grand cosmic tapestry. For thousands upon thousands of years, this spiritual empire flourished, stretching its influence across the nascent landmasses of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, establishing colonies that would one day become the mysterious roots of cultures like ancient Egypt and the lost tribes of the Americas. They were the architects of destiny, shaping the very timeline of human history, yet they operated in absolute secrecy, their true identity hidden behind layers of protective energy that prevented less evolved societies from staggering power. Why this secrecy? Because the Lemurians knew the fragile balance of the planet. They understood the terrifying cycles of global upheaval, the massive geophysical events that periodically cleanse the Earth of civilizations that have strayed too far from the central truth. They were the guardians of the Akashic records, the keepers of history itself. and they carried the unbearable burden of knowing that their own time, too, was finite, mapped out in the very stars they used for navigation and spiritual guidance. The true tragedy of Lemuria is not just that it sank, but how it sank. A horrific, instantaneous geologic convulsion that defies all modern explanation. We are not talking about slow erosion or gradual sea level rise. We are talking about a continent the size of half of Asia being yanked down into the abyssal depths in a single apocalyptic night. The very foundations of the earth screamed in protest, and the waves unleashed were not mere tsunamis, but kilometer-high walls of incandescent fury, capable of scouring the land clean and reshaping coastlines thousands of miles away. And what triggered this ultimate judgment? Was it the internal schism between the highly spiritual Movians and the technologically aggressive, expansionist Atlanteans, their geopolitical rivals across the globe? Was it a cosmic accident, a rogue celestial body, or the deliberate final act of the planet's own consciousness attempting to purge a toxic infection before it spread too far? We dive now into the very first chapter of this impossible history, the origins of the land they called Mu, and the unbelievable secrets of the beings who first stepped onto its emerald shores, carrying the blueprints of a perfect society, a society doomed to fail spectacularly. Brace yourself, because the legends of the sleeping giants are about to wake up, and the deep ocean holds on to its secrets fiercely. We begin where the land met the sky, millennia before recorded time. Imagine a landmass so vast, so geometrically perfect, that it swallowed the entire Pacific Ocean basin. Forget Pangaea, forget Gondwana. This was Lemuria, or as its own people called it, Mu, the forgotten motherland. Scientists today will scoff, citing tectonic plates and the unforgiving reality of deep-sea trenches, but the legends persist, whispered in the humid jungles of India and the dusty scrolls of forgotten Egyptian libraries. This wasn't just an island. It was a continental bridge, stretching like a colossal emerald spine from the coasts of modern-day Australia, reaching north toward the Hawaiian Islands and potentially touching the fringes of South America. Its immense size was only rivaled by the sublime perfection of its inhabitants. The inhabitants of Mu were a race unlike any known to human record. They were often described as the children of the sun, glowing with an internal vitality that set them apart from the nascent, struggling human tribes elsewhere in the world. They possessed a spiritual enlightenment so profound that war was not merely avoided, it was conceptually impossible. Their very societal structure was built on telepathic harmony and a deep, intrinsic understanding of cosmic law. Their cities were not built of stone and mortar, but of strange, non-metallic compounds that shimmered with captured solar energy, structures that seemed to defy gravity and the laws of known physics, shimmering towers of pure light. It is said they mastered the art of biological regeneration, extending their lifespans far beyond our comprehension. Disease was an abstraction, and physical labor was minimized through the use of crystalline power sources, drawing energy directly from the Earth's resonant frequency. They didn't rely on cumbersome engines or polluting fuels. Their ships soared through the air, gliding on invisible magnetic currents, traveling between the 70 great, glorious cities that dotted the Lemurian landscape, traversing the entire continent in mere hours. The central power source was the Great Crystal, humming at the heart of the capital city, Hirakoa, a beacon of pure light and consciousness that influenced the weather patterns and the very psychology of the people, keeping them in a state of eternal, blissful equilibrium. Day after day, Mu existed in this state of glorious, unassailable perfection. The skies were always a perfect azure, the vegetation lush beyond imagining, and the atmosphere thick with the smell of exotic, giant flowers that held medicinal properties, the ultimate apotheosis of life on Earth. This was a world without want, a civilization that had reached the evolutionary apex, where every soul knew its purpose and lived in complete, blissful alignment with the planet itself. They were masters of vibration and sound, capable of moving monumental objects merely by chanting, bending reality to their will. But even paradise, when built on a shifting foundation, is destined for ruin. The Lemurians were so focused on the ethereal, the spiritual, that they began to ignore the terrifying, deep-seated rumblings beneath their perfect feet, focused only on the heavens. Ancient texts speak of the elder priests of Mu, the Naakal, who began to notice subtle, terrifying changes in the Earth's energy grid. The crystal lattice that powered their cities, once steady and constant, began to flicker, almost imperceptibly at first, like a dying star far away. The Earth, their mother, was growing restless. The massive subterranean chambers of magma, the fiery heart that supported their vast continent, were beginning a seismic, catastrophic dance of death, the plates groaning under the impossible weight of Mu's stability. The Naakal received harrowing visions, prophecies of fire, water, and sudden darkness, but the everyday perfection of their lives made such apocalyptic warnings seem like the ramblings of the paranoid, easily dismissed by the majority who felt utterly secure in their enlightened superiority and spiritual shield. The great, fatal mistake of Mu was not hubris in technology, which they largely transcended, but hubris in spirituality. They believed their pure, evolved consciousness could override the physical laws of continental drift and instantaneous geological collapse. This arrogance sealed their fate. Beneath the shimmering, crystalline perfection of Hirakoa, immense pockets of gas began to form, trapped beneath the Earth's crust, waiting for the perfect moment to violently release their pent-up energy, like a cosmic pressure cooker ready to blow. They had achieved nirvana on Earth, a state that history suggests is entirely unsustainable when the planet itself decides it is done spinning for the day. As the Naakal desperately tried to channel the failing energies of the Great Crystal, they felt the first true, terrifying tremor, not a harmless shake, but a foundational groan that echoed the deep despair of the planet itself, a sound that cracked the very air. This was the moment the dream fractured. This was the silent, internal screaming before the Earth ripped wide open, swallowing centuries of unparalleled peace and wisdom in a matter of hours. Get ready, because the geological impossible is about to become reality, and the continent of Mu is about to begin its fatal, one-way descent into the abyssal, crushing darkness of the Pacific, never to be seen again. The descent was not graceful. It was a cosmic tearing, a sound beyond any human comprehension, registering simultaneously as a scream and a silence across the planet's fragile crust. The mantle below Mu, which had supported this impossible landmass for eons, simply yielded, collapsing inward like a rusted scaffold giving way under immense sudden pressure. This wasn't plate tectonics moving slowly. This was the immediate, violent inversion of a major segment of the Earth itself. The very bedrock beneath the great crystal cities of the Nazguls, the spiritual architects of this high society, cracked open with the speed of lightning, exposing the molten, burning heart of the world below. Mountains that had stood proud since the dawn of the Tertiary Age, peaks where the ancient priests communed with the sun god Ra-Mu, shuddered, then exploded outward in simultaneous, deafening volcanic bursts, painting the sky in ash and fire, signaling the final geological death knell of the Pacific paradise. In the golden temples of the capital city, R.E.M, where the vibrations of peace had been constant for 50,000 years, the high priests, the Nakals, watched in paralyzed horror as the perfect symmetry of their world disintegrated into chaotic, terrifying violence. They were masters of cosmic energy, practitioners of the deepest spiritual arts, yet their science offered no algorithm for this kind of spontaneous annihilation. Their perfect understanding of the universe suddenly hit a wall of brutal, terrifying geological reality that defied their vibrational mastery. They had seen the subtle signs, the deepening fissure lines in the sacred observatories, the strange heating of the underground thermal vents, but they had dismissed them as minor planetary adjustments, trusting implicitly in the eternal, immutable stability of their perfect paradise. Now they understood the terrifying truth. The Earth was actively rejecting them, the great continental root system failing under an impossible, immediate stress that shattered all prior knowledge of planetary mechanics. As the continental shelf began its rapid subsidence, the Pacific Ocean, a body of water larger and deeper than any ocean we know today, was displaced instantly and violently. Imagine draining a bathtub by pulling the entire bottom out at once. The resulting waves were not mere tsunamis, they were walls of liquid destruction rising thousands of feet into the ash-choked sky. These colossal liquid mountains raced inward, targeting the low-lying agricultural plains first, sweeping away entire populations before they could even utter a prayer to Ra-Mu. These were not 50-foot waves. These were oceanic displacements that dwarfed the highest peaks of the sinking continent, consuming cities whole in a single, terrifying gulp, turning the meticulous infrastructure of Lemuria into shattered coral and sand within minutes. The speed of the sinking was so rapid, some estimates suggest the bulk of the main island vanished in less than 24 hours, that escape was physically impossible for 99% of the population, trapping them inextricably in the catastrophic event horizon. The sheer mass of the water rushing to fill the void created a secondary phenomenon, gargantuan, world-shaking vortexes that spiraled downward, dragging even the largest, multi-tiered crystal pyramids into the abyss, crushing them under pressures that defy measurement, sealing them forever in the black, unrecoverable depths, awaiting the scrutiny of future deep-sea explorers who would find only silence. In those final, agonizing moments, the remaining Nakals, the spiritual elders, engaged in a desperate, last-ditch effort to preserve the sacred knowledge accumulated over tens of thousands of years. They activated their most powerful energy emitters, not to save the land, they knew that was futile, but to transmit the foundational principles of Mu's spirituality and science across the globe in a concentrated burst of psionic power. This was a psychic, energetic broadcast, a final, desperate message beamed instantaneously to the far-flung colonies and outposts scattered across the nascent lands we now call India, Mesoamerica, and Egypt, hoping the wisdom would take root. They were performing the ultimate sacrifice, sealing the great libraries and vibrational records inside specialized, indestructible energy fields, hoping that one day, when the tectonic agony subsided and humanity matured, future generations might recover the core wisdom of the motherland. It was an act of profound, agonizing foresight, knowing they were sacrificing their existence for the slim, desperate chance of humanity's future enlightenment. A chosen few, utilizing the sleek, humming Vimana airships powered by anti-gravity crystals, technology deemed absolutely mythological by modern historians, yet intensely real in that moment, were commanded to take immediate flight, carrying the most crucial artifacts and genetic samples. Their mission was simple, terrifying, and absolute: survive the global cataclysm and strategically seed the wisdom of Mu in the waiting, less developed civilizations of the East and West, ensuring the flame was not fully extinguished. These survivors, fleeing the epicenter of planetary destruction, looked back only once, witnessing the geological impossible. The entire center of the Pacific Ocean had become a chaotic cauldron of boiling steam, fire, and churning, angry water, swallowing the most perfect civilization the world had ever known. The light of Mu, the beacon of ancient perfection, was extinguished in a single, horrific, geological heartbeat, turning the cradle of civilization into a grave. The disappearance of Lemuria did not just erase a continent, it unleashed a global seismic shockwave so immense that every landmass on Earth registered the sudden, violent shift in planetary equilibrium. Coastal cities across the globe, from the future Mediterranean to the shores of Atlantis, which was still enjoying its golden age, were instantly decimated by the resulting mega-tsunamis, causing widespread devastation and forcing these advanced societies into sudden, dark ages of painful reconstruction. The atmospheric disturbance alone, caused by the trillions of tons of steam and ash shot into the stratosphere, plunged the world into a sudden, protracted volcanic winter that lasted for generations. The remaining colonies, once spiritually connected to the motherland, now found themselves isolated and completely alone. Their vital connections severed, left to scramble for survival in a world suddenly darkened, colder, and seismically unstable, forever haunted by the memory of the paradise that sank. The survivors, those few, broken souls who clung desperately to the shards of shattered islands, understood one terrifying truth: the world had fundamentally broken. It was not just a continent that had sunk, it was the very matrix of reality that had fractured. Their highly attuned spiritual senses, once humming with the resonant energy of Mu, were now deafened by the roar of chaos and the crushing silence of isolation. They were the living ghosts of perfection, stranded in an epoch of brutal imperfection. Every sunrise was a mocking reminder of the glorious, seamless days before the earth swallowed their homeland whole, and every tremor of the newly volatile crust was a promise of future destruction. They looked out over the endless, cold ocean, realizing that the spiritual umbilical cord connecting them to the High Council and the infinite wisdom of the Lemurian masters was irrevocably severed. They were adrift, cut off from the stream of pure universal consciousness that had defined their civilization. What remained was memory, a glorious, agonizing phantom limb of knowledge. The great crystal libraries, the energy grids, the harmonic resonators that powered their cities and amplified their consciousness, all were now submerged beneath crushing oceanic pressure, relics of a golden age utterly unattainable. The few priests and high initiates who escaped carried fragments of the sacred doctrines engraved not on stone, but on the fragile tablets of their own minds, burdened by a knowledge too vast for a crumbling civilization to bear. They faced the immediate, terrifying task of survival, finding food, shelter, and fighting the creeping despair that threatened to extinguish the last flicker of Lemurian light. But the greater tragedy was the loss of the great protocols, the spiritual blueprints for their society. These were the complex, rhythmic instructions for maintaining the planet's vibrational harmony, the very essence of their advanced physics and metaphysics. And without them, the survivors began to drift, their inherent perfection eroding under the relentless pressure of a harsh, unforgiving environment that demanded brutal physical labor instead of pure thought. This was the first great migration of the broken heart. These fragmented lineages scattered like cosmic dust across the newly formed archipelagos of the Pacific, migrating west toward the Indian landmass and south toward the great island of Madagascar, a crucial anchor point that had barely clung to the surface during the final catastrophic shift. They carried their ancestral trauma, their advanced genetic memory, and, critically, the language of the stars, the original root tongue that modern linguistics still desperately attempts to trace. This primal language, once capable of shaping matter with sound, was now reduced to guttural whispers of grief and instruction. Imagine these beings, once operating on pure light and thought, now having to fashion crude tools, having to hunt, having to fear the dark, a concept utterly alien to the illuminated world of Mu. This descent from transcendence was agonizing, giving birth to the deep, primal fears that still plague the human subconscious to this day, an inherited terror of sudden, absolute loss. The masters who landed on the shores of what would become the ancient precursors to India brought with them the foundation for the complex Vedic knowledge, twisted and simplified through necessity, but retaining the core truth of cosmic cycles, karma, and eternal recurrence, all shadows of the pristine Lemurian understanding. Those who sailed the eastern expanses became the legendary navigators of the Pacific, using not instruments but the residual energy lines of the sunken continent, the memory of the currents, and their own psychic resonance to chart thousands of miles of open water. They were driven by an endless, burning hope to find the sunken heart of their world. As generations passed, the clarity of the memory faded. The perfect, enlightened beings of Mu were transformed in the retelling into demigods, heroes, and eventually mythical figures who lived in a heaven they could no longer reach. This dilution of pure spiritual science into superstitious religion was the second great tragedy of Lemuria, the final surrender of clarity to faith. And worse, the survivors who struggled the most began to harbor resentment toward the perfect ones who, they believed, failed to prevent the catastrophe. A fierce schism erupted, dividing the remnants of the once united society into two warring spiritual factions. Some clung desperately to the path of light, trying to maintain the harmonic resonance despite the practical impossibility, dedicating their lives to protecting the few remaining fragments of pure knowledge, hiding them in deep caves and high mountain retreats. Others, terrified, vengeful, and desperate for power, began to tamper with the remaining fragments of Lemurian technology and spiritual power, focusing their intentions not on universal upliftment, but on localized defense and self-preservation, aiming to control the terrifying forces of nature. For centuries, the primary obsession of the Lemurian diaspora became the location of the great resonating crystal, the central power source of the submerged civilization. Legend spoke of a deep-sea cavern, perhaps still pressurized, where this phenomenal artifact continued to pulse, waiting for the righteous to return and reignite the world. They believed that if they could only re-establish the psychic link with that heartstone, they could reverse the polar shift, stabilize the crust, and perhaps, just perhaps, pull Mu back up from the crushing blackness of the abyss. This quest became the secret, terrifying mandate of every high priest, every master mariner, and every keeper of the ancient lore. Every ancient map, every star chart passed down through whispers and song was a coded attempt to locate the one singular point where the world could be reconnected, where the trauma could be undone, and where the memory of paradise could finally be redeemed from the ocean's dark grasp. The sunken continent was silent, but its magnetic pull on the survivors was absolute and eternal. The oceanic burial of Lemuria was not merely a geological catastrophe. It was an instantaneous planetary amputation, leaving the fragmented consciousness of the greatest civilization ever known weeping across the face of the traumatized Earth. The survivors, the children of Mu, were scattered like seeds flung from a supernova, their perfect society instantly reduced to desperate, isolated packets of sublime genetic memory. They landed on shores that were alien, hostile, and utterly unprepared for the arrival of psychic superbeings who understood the secrets of the cosmos and the precise calibration of the Earth's mantle. Imagine being plucked from paradise and deposited onto a world struggling with the concept of fire and the invention of the wheel. This forced, violent diaspora instantly shattered the intricate, unified telepathic network that had been Lemuria's greatest defense and deepest strength. The survivors were suddenly alone, hearing only the echoing silence where millennia of shared thought had once resided. The legends of the immediate aftermath are terrifying. Waves of intense, debilitating grief that drove many to madness, unable to cope with the sudden loss of their soul bond with the land. Their first instinct was not to build, but to hide. The core of the surviving population, however, recognized their absolute duty to preserve the flame of Mu and subtly guide the burgeoning, chaotic human civilizations toward enlightenment, even if it meant burying their own history beneath layers of myth. They separated into three primary directional movements, known in the esoteric histories as the three great seeds of the motherland. Each path carried a different burden of knowledge and sought a different kind of refuge from the relentless, crushing memory of the cataclysm. The first seed, the Keepers of the Sun, traveled east and north, threading their way through the narrow continental shelf that would later become Southeast Asia, eventually settling in the high, impenetrable plateaus of the Himalayas. They became the silent hermits, the architects of the sacred texts, establishing hidden, vibrating monasteries designed purely to maintain the highest spiritual frequency of the planet, a perpetual psychic beacon against the return of utter darkness. Their goal was not to rule, but to remember the language of creation, maintaining the flawless Lemurian understanding of vibration and sound, a legacy that would later whisper through the Vedas and the oldest Tibetan scrolls. The second seed, the navigators of the deep, followed the path of the setting sun, utilizing their advanced anti-gravity ships disguised as simple sea vessels, tracing the old energy lines toward the vast, empty expanse of the South Pacific. These were the purists, determined to avoid contamination by the emerging lower vibrational civilizations of the continents. They established small, enigmatic island communities, mastering coral engineering and astronomical mapping. They are the source of the Polynesian navigational miracles and the massive, inexplicable stone faces that stare out across the Pacific. Not monuments to kings, but giant, complex, energetic resonators meant to stabilize the planetary crust. But it was the third, and perhaps most dangerous seed that headed west, driven by a fierce determination to correct the fatal flaw that had destroyed their homeland. These were the Lemurian scientists, the engineers of the crystal grids, the ones obsessed with stability. They traveled across the Atlantic basin, eventually establishing themselves on a geologically young and promising landmass known today only by its terrible consequence, Atlantis. This was not a primitive culture, it was a direct, calculated continuation of Mu. Atlantis was built upon the technological ruins of Lemuria, but fueled by a devastating psychological shift. Where Mu trusted the spirit, Atlantis would rely on absolute physical control, determined to cage the planetary forces they now saw as treacherous enemies. They utilized the recovered technological secrets, the vril energy, the crystal power focus, but stripped them of their sacred context, making them instruments of power rather than tools of harmony. The Lemurians had been spiritual kings. The Atlanteans became technological tyrants in the making. Before their dispersion, however, the elders of Mu performed a final, chilling act. Recognizing that the time for open knowledge had passed, they sealed their records, the true history, the cosmic equations, the warnings, within colossal underground chambers. These Akashic vaults, or time capsules, were engineered to withstand millennia of seismic activity and oceanic pressure, strategically placed beneath major geological fault lines and powered by dormant geothermal vents. Their existence was the ultimate failsafe. They were psychic time bombs, set to unlock only when humanity's collective consciousness reached a point of spiritual maturity, ensuring that the technology would never again be placed in the hands of the ego-driven or the unprepared. The survivors, now operating in deep stealth, became the hidden foundation of every subsequent great civilization. They were the anonymous teachers, the mythical founders, the beings who taught agriculture, writing, and the construction of megalithic observatories. The weight of this secret was unbearable. They were immortal beings living among the mortal, forbidden from revealing the truth of the drowned paradise, or the terrifying ease with which a perfect civilization can vanish entirely from the terrestrial plane. The ocean held the map to their redemption, but the cost of retrieving it was unknown. The redemption that the Lemurians sought was not spiritual, that they had already mastered, but purely physical, a desperate attempt to stabilize the very bedrock beneath their luminous floating cities. They had reached the zenith of consciousness, yet their world was beginning to tremor, a slow, terrifying vibration that defied the peaceful hum of their harmonic existence. The cost of retrieving the ocean's map, the forbidden knowledge of the deep tectonic plates, was a price they were only beginning to calculate in the currency of dread and impending doom. For millennia, Lemuria had been powered by the mighty fire crystals, colossal geodes harvested from the Earth's magma vents and attuned to the psychic rhythm of the high priests and the vast conscious population. These crystals, far more than mere energy sources, were the continent's very nervous system, distributing life force and maintaining the delicate balance of continental stability against the crushing pressure of the global ocean. But now, the resonance was jagged, a discordant shriek in the previously perfect symphony of planetary mechanics, signaling an internal rebellion deep within the Earth's mantle, a geological fury that could not be mediated by meditation alone. The elders, those venerable beings whose skin shimmered with the accumulated light of 100 generations, began to experience terrifying nightmares, not of war or famine, which they had long abolished, but of silence and crushing pressure, the overwhelming weight of the primal ocean returning to claim its own, erasing every trace of their perfection. Their civilization had evolved past physical science. They believed true reality was malleable, governed solely by thought and collective will. To suggest that cold, brute geological force could destroy their meticulously constructed spiritual edifice was considered a profound heresy, the ultimate denial of their collective power and mastery over the terrestrial sphere. This profound, almost arrogant hubris, this blinding faith in the supremacy of mind over matter, became the fatal hairline fracture in the foundation of their perfect society, a weakness that the rumbling core of the Earth was about to exploit with brutal and instantaneous efficiency. They initially dismissed the escalating tremors as mere temporary psychic disturbances, minor fluctuations in the global thought field that simply required more focused meditation, intensified collective harmonization sessions, and a reaffirmation of their shared, peaceful reality. They simply could not fathom a threat that originated not from within, but from the very ground upon which they stood. But the fire crystals were telling a different, far more alarming story, one written in molten light and fractured geodes, a language of pure destruction that defied all their spiritual axioms. Reports flooded the grand temple of shattered energy conduits, critical power grid collapses localized in the deepest western sectors of the continent, areas closest to the volatile, seismically active Pacific Ring of Fire, a region they had always studiously ignored, deeming it too chaotic and too low vibrational for their refined energies. Then, the unthinkable happened. One starless night, the magnificent sky lighthouse of Mu, which usually cast a benign azure beam of perpetual light across the entire capital city, sputtered, flickered violently, and died completely for 3 agonizing seconds, plunging the most advanced civilization the world had ever known into absolute, primal, terrifying blackness. The sheer shock of this darkness, something utterly unknown for 10,000 years of continuous illumination, was a physical blow to the collective psyche. The first true visceral moment of raw panic and existential dread they had ever collectively experienced, tearing the veil of their assured serenity. The Council of Elders finally, reluctantly acknowledged that the threat was overwhelmingly terrestrial, an enemy of stone and fire that could not be negotiated with or purified by conscious thought. They commissioned the Deep Dive Contingent, a group composed of Lemuria's most brilliant yet historically marginalized geophysicists and engineers, men and women who still remembered how to interpret the ancient seismic scrolls that the enlightened majority had long dismissed as crude, fear-based artifacts of a less evolved time. Their mission was simple and terrifyingly urgent: descend immediately into the deepest abyssal trenches of the newly unstable western coast and retrieve the forbidden geological map, the one detailing the critical subduction zones, the volatile fault lines, and the exact coordinates of every deep Earth instability that their ancestors had intentionally suppressed, choosing blissful ignorance over stressful truth. It was widely rumored that this map, stored in a pressurized, submerged vault carved directly into the bedrock, contained the exact location of the impending fracture, the single point where the continental plate would finally give way, ripping their perfect world apart like thin, moistened parchment. The deep dive contingent deployed in modified, heavily shielded crystalline submersibles, vessels built not just to withstand crushing physical pressure, but also the overwhelming weight of spiritual doubt and societal collapse now pressing down upon them. As they descended, the normally frigid ocean waters around their hulls began to heat unnaturally, bubbling violently with thermal vents that had suddenly sprung to life, a definitive testament to the internal inferno awakening beneath the ocean floor. The pressure gauge readings within the submersibles were beyond catastrophic, spiking and falling in violent, unpredictable rhythms, mirroring the erratic, failing heartbeat of a dying planet that was actively shedding its surface layers. The Elder Council, watching the live holographic feed projected in the silent temple, witnessed the truly unthinkable. Vast canyons tearing open on the seafloor, fissures that spat luminous, toxic plumes of superheated magma and steam, signaling the immediate and irreversible breakdown of the tectonic integrity that sustained their entire continent. They realized with a cold, sickening certainty that their perfect world was built upon a profound lie of stability, a temporary reprieve granted by the sleeping giant of geology, and that the giant was now awake and enraged. The desperate race was no longer to save Lemuria itself, which was already doomed, but merely to understand how it would end, to record the truth of the cataclysmic process. The retrieval of the map now meant the acquisition of absolute, crushing, final truth, a brutal document that would ensure their descendants, if any minuscule fragment of them survived the coming baptism by fire and water, would never repeat the catastrophic, fatal mistake of ignoring the fundamental, brute laws of the physical cosmos in favor of spiritual fantasy. The map was within their grasp, but the Earth's final tremor was already beginning to reverberate up through the ocean depths, signaling the arrival of the moment of ultimate reckoning. The air pressure dropped so violently it felt like a physical punch to the chest of every inhabitant of Mu. It wasn't the slow, grinding sound of plate tectonics they had studied, but a sudden, ripping noise, the sound of the very foundation of the world tearing itself apart at the seams. Fear, an emotion long banished from their enlightened society, returned like a toxic tidal wave, washing over the golden temples of the capital city, Sundaria. The priests and the High Council, known as the Children of the Blue Star, gathered instantly, their ancient psychic abilities straining against the insurmountable physical reality of the planet's fury. Their collective meditation, powerful enough to shift weather patterns across hemispheres, was utterly useless against this primordial, raw, geological force. They projected fields of pure, resonant energy, attempting to stabilize the magma flow beneath the crust, to knit together the fracturing basalt rock that formed their island home. The energy shields flared bright, momentarily silencing the terrifying groans of the earth, promising a flicker of hope that their mastery over consciousness could truly supersede the laws of physics. But the Earth is not sentient in the way they understood. It is a machine of fire and stone, indifferent to the fate of the fleeting perfection blooming on its surface. The counterforce was instant and devastating. The psychic energy they projected was absorbed, neutralized, and then spat back at them in the form of a hyper-accelerated wave of seismic compression, shattering every crystal lattice they had used for millennia to regulate their internal power. This was not a battle they could win with pure thought. This was the planet shedding an inconvenient piece of its shell. And the realization hit the children of the blue star with the force of 1,000 megatons. They were simply too small, too fleeting, against the clockwork brutality of cosmic geology. The western coast of Lemuria, the lush, tropical heartland where the legendary Nakal tablets were originally guarded, began to sink first. It didn't slide or erode. It simply disappeared. Imagine a giant hand pressing down on a sponge, forcing all the surrounding water up and out. This created the initial continent-sized displacement wave, a tsunami of impossible height, rising hundreds of feet into the sky, dwarfing even the tallest crystal towers of Mu that scraped the low clouds. Witnesses from the eastern highlands, those who had mere minutes left to live, described the ocean not just roaring, but howling, a sound that carried the crushing weight of 5 million square miles of seawater being instantly thrown skyward. The pressure wave alone ruptured the eardrums of anyone within 100 miles of the coastline, leaving a silence that was more terrifying than the noise itself. In Sundoria, the capital, built on the most geologically stable central plateau, or so they believed, the panic turned to profound, resigned sorrow, a collective acceptance of the inevitable terminus. The great central crystal, the pulsating heart of their global energy grid, began to flicker wildly, overloaded by the catastrophic feedback loop from the collapsing land masses. High Priestess Lyra, keeper of the final prophecy and descendant of the Star Kings, stood before the crystal, not trying to save the city, but trying to save the memory. She began the ultimate, desperate psychic transmission, a final, coherent burst of their civilization's entire knowledge base aimed outwards into the cosmic ether, hoping to reach future consciousnesses on Earth or beyond the solar boundaries. The transmission contained the secrets of zero-point energy, the true meaning of the human aura, the blueprints for anti-gravity vehicles, and the complete history of their evolutionary journey from spiritual infancy to divine mastery. It was a digital archive encoded in pure thought, a time capsule shot into the void just as the ground beneath her feet was dissolving into vaporized rock. The structural integrity of the entire continent gave way in less than an hour. The mantle plume beneath Lemuria had effectively failed, opening a void where solid ground once stood. This wasn't a slow sinking like Atlantis. This was a violent, implosive collapse, the land accelerating downwards at impossible speeds. The ocean didn't just rush over the continent. The ocean rushed in to fill the vacuum left by the collapsing crust, meeting the superheated magma below in a confrontation of steam and pure destructive energy that defied all conventional understanding of oceanic pressure. The resulting explosion was suboceanic, yet it shook the globe, registering instantly on every primitive seismograph operating in the distant, surviving civilizations like Egypt and Sumeria. They recorded not an earthquake, but a planetary shudder, a vast hollow sound as if the earth had coughed up a continent and then violently swallowed the sea. The plume of vaporized water and superheated air shot 20 miles into the stratosphere, forming a temporary, terrifying shield that blocked the sun and initiated a terrifying, albeit brief, global cooling event that would later become mythologized as a darkening of the skies. But wait, not everyone was caught in the impossible vortex. While the vast majority, the millions who chose to stay and meditate their way into the next dimensional plane, accepting their fate, were instantly consumed, a tiny, determined minority had already activated the final, most terrifying technology: the star shuttles. These were not the gentle, shimmering anti-gravity craft used for daily transport. These were deep space vessels, armored and designed for colonization beyond the solar system, hidden in deep subterranean bunkers until this precise, final moment of reckoning. Their launch sequence, initiated just seconds before the planetary shudder, was rough, brutal, and utterly chaotic, tearing through the exploding steam curtain like bullets through tissue paper. A handful of these vessels, perhaps only 7, managed to pierce the rapidly closing atmospheric chaos. They carried with them the most crucial genetic material, and more importantly, the physical Na-Cal tablets, the very map that had started this entire, impossible race against time. They soared into the blackness, utterly alone, watching the Earth transform from a peaceful blue marble into a swirling vortex of steam and planetary trauma. Lemuria was gone. The world had changed forever, and the survivors of the most perfect civilization history has never acknowledged were now refugees, scattering across the cosmos, carrying the weight of a drowned world on their shoulders. Their destination? Uncertain. Their mission? To ensure the seed of Mu could one day bloom again on a new, unsuspecting planet, far away from the tectonic nightmares of their origin. The true story of Lemuria had just become the ultimate interstellar ghost story. The tectonic shriek had faded, and the vast, churning Pacific Ocean now swallowed the grave of the motherland. But the true danger wasn't the sunken landmass. It was the whispered knowledge, the consciousness they had perfected, that now floated free, unmoored and unprotected in a primitive world. The few surviving initiates, those high priests and priestesses who had read the final, devastating prophecy in the crystal matrices, were scattered across the globe like embers from a dying supernova. They carried not gold nor armies, but the entirety of Lemurian science, history, and spiritual mastery etched into their very souls, protected by energetic cloaks no earthly civilization could penetrate. Their mission, whispered into the new dark age, was terrifyingly simple: to prevent the younger, chaotic human races, who were only just beginning to walk upright and look toward the stars, from repeating the cataclysm that swallowed their paradise whole. They were the ultimate planetary security force, utterly invisible. Imagine the sheer, crushing burden of memory. These were beings who remembered the Earth when the Moon was a younger, different entity, when the atmosphere was thick with life-sustaining ether, and when gravity seemed slightly less insistent on pulling everything down to its core. They landed on shorelines populated by tribal, frightened humans, whom they saw as children playing with fire. The Exodus, known in hidden lore as the Great Dispersion of the Feathered Serpents, was meticulous and highly directed. One major contingent sailed relentlessly east, guided by astral charts that defied earthly navigation and followed magnetic pathways only they could perceive, eventually establishing the core spiritual teachings that would later become the bedrock of the Tibetan mystery schools, hiding their secrets high in the impossible, desolate reaches of the Himalayas. This was the origin of the hidden doctrine of Shambhala, a physical location that existed primarily as a frequency, a place where the Lemurian masters could maintain the purity of their vibration, keeping the motherland's memory alive, protected by the sheer altitude and the fierce winds of the roof of the world. Another substantial group sailed west, finding refuge in the nascent civilizations arising in the high-altitude plateau of the Andes, where the knowledge of cosmic architecture manifested in impossible stonework, a subtle, silent reminder of Mu's building prowess. Look closely at the cyclopean construction of Sacsayhuaman, at the precise astronomical alignments of Tiahuanaco, and you see the unmistakable, zero-tolerance mathematical fingerprint of the vanished continent. Blocks weighing hundreds of tons, cut with the surgical precision of a modern laser, yet accomplished millennia before the wheel was commonplace. This wasn't primitive work, it was survival architecture. But the most crucial destination, the one that held the most promise and, simultaneously, the most devastating threat, was the rising island continent of Atlantis, flourishing in the central Atlantic Ocean. The Atlanteans, descendants of a slightly younger, more aggressive strain of humanity, were already demonstrating a terrifying aptitude for manipulating raw energy. The surviving elders of Mu saw Atlantis not as a new home, but as a dangerous, volatile laboratory. They tried desperately to infuse the burgeoning Atlantean science, which was rapidly mastering technology through massive crystal manipulation and harnessing atmospheric electricity, often called vril or prana, with the ethical, spiritual grounding that Mu had always maintained. Mu used the crystal grids to harmonize weather patterns, power silent, levitating transport systems, and enhance spiritual telepathy, a technology of pure peace and communal upliftment. Atlantis, however, used the very same power source to create terrifying, localized weapons of mass destruction, capable of melting mountains and shifting smaller land masses purely for resource extraction and military intimidation. This became the fundamental, unresolvable schism of the ancient world. The conflict between the pure, compassionate spiritual mastery of Mu and the arrogant, power-hungry technological supremacy of Atlantis. The Lemurians, the children of the sun, preached unity with the cosmos and respect for the planetary organism. The Atlanteans, the sons of Belial in later esoteric texts, craved dominion over it, seeing the earth as merely a resource to be exploited. The Lemurian masters delivered their final, desperate, terrifying warning. The overuse of these centralized crystalline energy grids, the tampering with planetary rotational forces for military and convenience purposes, would inevitably lead to a violent planetary correction. The Earth, a living organism, they declared, would purge the infection of technological hubris. But the Atlantean High Council, blinded by their own magnificence and protected by shimmering force fields powered by the legendary energy system that lit their capital, Poseidonis, laughed at the ragged survivors of the sunken continent. They believed their technology made them gods, immune to nature's wrath, utterly superior to mere geology. They ignored the silent, desperate tears of the Lemurian priests, who knew the look of an empire walking willingly toward its own obliteration. It was a dark, catastrophic mirror image of their own ending, only this time driven not by inevitable, uncontrollable tectonic fate, but by reckless, self-serving ego and a lust for power that knew no bounds. Knowing their warnings were utterly in vain, the remaining Lemurian survivors didn't just teach, they entombed. They performed the greatest, most secure act of preservation humanity has ever witnessed, constructing secret subterranean vaults beneath the shifting sands of Egypt, the crushing ice of the poles, and deep within the impenetrable jungle roots of Central America. These weren't dusty scrolls, they were energetic records, shielded and vibrating, known today in deep esoteric circles as the halls of Amenti or the original template for the Akashic records, vast libraries of pure consciousness and factual history secured against the coming flood. They encoded the entirety of their advanced mathematics, their miraculous genetic mastery, their understanding of zero-point energy, and the devastating story of their civilization's failure into the very structure of reality, waiting for the time when humanity was finally mature enough to receive it. And then they waited. They waited for the inevitable, slow-motion disaster they knew Atlantis was preparing to unleash upon itself. The ultimate irony, the cosmic cruelty of it all, was that the destruction of Mu was instantaneous and geological. The destruction of Atlantis would be a slow, agonizing suicide by technological hubris, played out over centuries. The world held its breath, unknowingly poised between two great cataclysms, the memory of Mu and the impending shadow of Atlantis. The ancient guardians of the Pacific had done their part to preserve the seed. Now, the fate of all future humanity rested on whether the Atlantean arrogance would finally break the planetary system entirely. The interstellar ghost story had landed, and it was about to witness its terrifying sequel.